March 18th, 1991. A 2-year-old boy plays in his front yard in rural Oregon while his father, a deputy sheriff, goes for a jog. 30 minutes later, the boy is gone. Search teams comb the woods. Helicopters sweep the ridges. Dogs lose his scent at the gate. No footprints, no blood, nothing. For 3 years, no one knows what happened. Then his little sister, now 7, tells police what she saw from her bedroom window, and it shatters the secret that had been buried for years. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive mystery stories. Azalea, Oregon doesn't appear on most maps. It's not a town, really. More a scattering of homes along Highway 227, tucked into the forested hills northeast of Glendale. Douglas County, logging country, the kind of place where mailboxes stand at the ends of long driveways, and the nearest grocery store is a 20-minute drive. In 1991, fewer than 900 people lived in the area. The Gibson home sat at the end of one of those driveways, a single-wide mobile home with a small front yard, a tilting carport, and a fence that needed mending. Beyond the fence, the woods began. Dense stands of Douglas fir, oak, underbrush thick enough to hide a deer. Larry Gibson was 34 years old that spring, a deputy sheriff with Douglas County, 12 years on the force. He wore the uniform well, pressed, polished, everything in its place. People in town knew him as steady, reliable. The kind of man who didn't raise his voice or make a scene. His wife Judith was 31, quiet, a homemaker. She kept the house clean, the children fed, the routines running. She didn't ask many questions. They had 2 children, Karen, 4.5, Tommy, 2.5, and Larry's half-brother, Michael, lived with them too. A young man in his 20s, helping with rent. It was a small house for 5 people, but they managed. That morning, Tuesday, March 18th, Larry had the day off. He'd planned to go for a run. Maybe 2 miles, he told Judith. Clear his head before lunch. Judith was in the kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes. The water ran warm over her hands. She could hear the television in the living room, some morning program she wasn't watching. Karen was in her bedroom, looking for something. A shoe, maybe, or a toy. Tommy was already outside. The front yard was small, maybe 20 feet from the porch to the fence. Grass, patchy and uneven. A swing set off to one side, the chains rusted but still holding. Tommy had a toy truck, bright yellow plastic, one wheel missing. He dragged it through the dirt, making engine sounds in his throat, soft, breathy, the way toddlers do when they're playing alone. Larry came out onto the porch around 11:30. He was already dressed for his run, shorts, a t-shirt, running shoes tied tight, and his service weapon, a .45 caliber Colt pistol holstered at his hip. It wasn't unusual for deputies to carry off duty. Habit, protocol, part of the uniform that never really came off. He stood on the porch for a moment watching his son. The boy looked up, waved. "Bye-bye, Daddy." Larry nodded. "Stay in the yard," he said. "Your sister's coming out." Then he checked the gate latch, turned, and jogged down the driveway. The road curved away through the trees, gravel crunching under his feet. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. He ran for a while, past the neighbor's property, past the stand of pines where the road dipped low. His breath settled into a rhythm, in, out, steady. Then he saw it, a gray cat slinking through the ditch near the edge of the road. Larry slowed, stopped, drew his pistol. The cat had been a problem for weeks, tearing through trash cans, yowling at night. He'd called animal control twice, but no one came out this far. People handled their own problems out here. He aimed, fired once. The shot cracked through the stillness. A handful of crows scattered from a nearby fence post. The cat bolted into the brush. Larry holstered the weapon and kept running. He thought he'd missed. When Larry came back up the driveway, his watch read 12:15, 47 minutes, longer than he'd planned. Judith was on the porch, shading her eyes against the light. "Larry," her voice was tight, "is Tommy with you?" He stopped. "What?" "He's gone. I can't find him." Larry looked at the yard. The swing, motionless. The toy truck on its side in the dirt. The gate, open wider than he'd left it. He called out, "Tommy!" Nothing. He walked the perimeter, checked behind the porch, the shed, the woodpile, called again, louder this time. Judith ran along the fence line, peering into the trees. They circled the house, once, twice, their voices growing hoarse. When they found nothing, Larry went to his patrol car, the white sedan with the county insignia on the door, and drove up the road, leaning on the horn. He stopped at the first intersection, called out, reversed, came back. Judith was still by the porch, crying now. At 12:55, they called the sheriff's department. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. 2-year-old male, last seen in front yard, brown hair, brown eyes, purple sweatshirt, checkered sneakers. Within an hour, patrol units began arriving. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the driveway was lined with vehicles. Neighbors, volunteer firefighters, church members, Larry's own Boy Scout troop, teenagers in green shirts carrying flashlights and walkie-talkies. The sheriff's office set up a command post near the mailbox. Search dogs arrived first. Their handlers walked them in slow circles through the yard, then down the road. The dogs caught a scent at the gate, followed it 50 yards, then lost it. Helicopters appeared overhead, blades chopping the air. Men waded through Swamp Creek behind the property. Others combed the tall grass by the fence, checked under porches, searched abandoned sheds. The hours blurred together. Judith moved mechanically, answered questions, pointed to where she'd last seen her son. Her hands shook when she held her coffee cup. Larry walked the search grid again and again. His face was blank, unreadable. When deputies asked how long he'd been gone, he said, "About 45 minutes. They wrote it down." By 4 in the afternoon, the search had expanded 2 miles in every direction. Neighbors checked their barns. Firefighters marked cleared areas with orange tape. Nothing, not a shoe, not a footprint, not a broken branch. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, the temperature fell. Someone brought coffee in paper cups. Another volunteer offered to drive Judith into town, but she refused. "He'll come back here," she said quietly. "He has to." Larry went inside. When he came back out, he was wearing his uniform, tan shirt, badge polished, sidearm holstered. One of the deputies noticed, wrote it in his report later. Unusual behavior for a parent of a missing child. By 6 o'clock, the sheriff called a pause. "We'll start again at first light," he said. The volunteers nodded, pale and tired. One of them picked up the yellow toy truck and set it on the porch railing. When the last vehicle pulled away, the sound of engines faded into the hills. Judith stood on the porch, arms crossed against the cold. Larry stayed beside her, staring at the darkening yard. Inside, the kitchen table was still set for lunch, the sandwiches untouched. For a long time, neither of them spoke. At first light on March 19th, the search resumed. A fresh grid was drawn. Deputies from neighboring counties joined in. More volunteers, more dogs. The Mormon church sent teams. Larry's Boy Scout troop returned. They moved through the woods in straight lines, calling Tommy's name as if volume alone could bring him back. By mid-morning, nearly 100 people were searching. Helicopters swept low over Swamp Creek. Deputies on horseback searched the far banks. Fog settled along the ridges, and every shout seemed to dissolve into it. Larry moved among the searchers, calm, methodical, giving directions when asked. He carried a clipboard, noted zones, checked maps. Those who knew him said he looked like a man doing his job. Those who didn't found it strange. Judith stayed by the house, refusing to rest. Each time a vehicle slowed near the driveway, she looked up, hoping. By noon, the sheriff told her they were expanding the perimeter another mile. Larry nodded in agreement, then went inside to change. When he came out again, he was freshly shaved, uniform crisp, badge gleaming. Deputies whispered about it that afternoon. One wrote in his report, "Gibson appears unusually composed, maintains control but lacks affect. States he needs to look professional for the media." The press arrived in full by the second day. A news crew from Portland filmed the command post. Larry stood in front of the cameras, answering questions in short, clipped sentences. "We're doing everything we can," he said. "Every minute counts." His voice was steady. His face was blank. Judith stood beside him, pale and silent. In the days that followed, the search grew outward like a spill. Fields, creeks, roads, all combed again and again. Teams of volunteers searched by lantern light long after midnight. They found footprints, none small enough for a 2-year-old. The toy truck on the porch was the only trace of Tommy anyone ever found. The sheriff's office began reconstructing the timeline. Larry said he'd left home at 11:30 a.m. for his jog. The route, roughly 2 miles round trip, should have taken 20 minutes. He returned, he said, around 12:15. That was 45 minutes, maybe 50. Judith placed the moment she realized Tommy was missing closer to 12:30. The call to dispatch was logged at 12:55. That left 30 minutes unaccounted for. Then there was the car. Larry had driven his patrol vehicle that morning, a white sheriff's sedan. The odometer showed an additional 7 miles that weren't on record. When questioned, Larry explained that after searching the yard, he'd driven to a nearby rest area to check whether Tommy had wandered that far. The sheriff accepted the answer, but made a note of it. A second inconsistency emerged a few days later. Larry admitted firing his weapon that morning. He'd taken a shot at a stray cat before his run, he said. Missed. When investigators returned to the area, they found a dead cat near the tree line, 50 yards from the road. 2 bullets, skull and chest. Ballistic tests matched both rounds to Larry's pistol. It was an odd detail, one detective later recalled. People miss, people lie, but rarely both in the same story. By the end of March, the organized search was scaled back. The helicopters were grounded. The volunteers went home. A smaller investigative team took over. Then came a statement from 4-year-old Karen Gibson. During an interview with 2 detectives, she said she'd seen a truck pull into the driveway while her father was out jogging. Inside, she said, were a blonde woman and a dark-haired man. "They took Tommy," she said quietly. "They drove away." Detectives asked her to describe the vehicle. She said it was yellow or brownish. They asked if she knew the people. She shook her head. The statement was carefully written down, but no one could verify it. There were no tire tracks on the gravel, no neighbors who reported seeing a truck that day. Still, the description was released to the public. Tan or gold pickup truck, possibly older model, 2 occupants. For weeks, that image was everywhere, on posters, in newscasts, in the minds of people driving down Oregon highways. No such vehicle was ever found. Inside the department, doubts began to circle. Officers who had worked alongside Larry for years said he seemed distant, detached, sometimes irritated when questioned. He rarely spoke about Tommy directly. When he did, his voice stayed flat. The sheriff held a private meeting with senior staff in April. Officially, the case remained a missing child investigation. Unofficially, they began to wonder whether something else had happened. The issue was delicate. Larry was one of their own, a deputy with 12 years on the force, a father, a man whose house they had searched and whose wife they had comforted. But the facts refused to sit still. The route that should have taken 20 minutes had taken 50. The shot that was supposed to miss had struck. The car that should have been parked had moved 7 miles. And through it all, Larry's composure never cracked. By summer, the media attention waned. Reporters moved on to other stories. Azalea went back to its quiet pace. The Gibson house looked untouched again. Judith stopped giving interviews. She attended church less often, spent most of her time at home with Karen. Larry returned to work in June, but was kept on limited duty, routine paperwork, occasional patrol. Inside the department, whispers followed him like a shadow. One deputy recalled walking into the locker room and finding Larry staring at his own reflection for a long time. When asked how he was holding up, Larry said, "You just keep doing what you know how to do." In July, the sheriff placed him on administrative leave. The department cited the need for rest and distance. Larry accepted without protest. The investigation continued into the fall. Detectives re-interviewed neighbors, reviewed call logs, compared statements again. Nothing changed. No one had seen a truck. No one had heard a struggle. The yard showed no disturbance. The Oregon State Police Lab confirmed the ballistics findings. Same 2 bullets, same weapon. But without evidence linking the shots to Tommy's disappearance, it was meaningless on paper. Judith, interviewed again in September, described her husband as quiet, tired, trying not to think. She said she believed the story about the truck, believed someone had taken her son. But when asked if she trusted Larry's version of events completely, she hesitated. "I think he tells what he can live with," she said. By winter, the case had slowed to a crawl. The sheriff's office filed its last progress report in December 1991. The opening line read simply, "Investigation ongoing. Subject missing. No further developments." Larry spent the holidays at home. Karen asked again where her brother was. Judith told her that Tommy was with Angels, then corrected herself, said they were still looking. Larry said nothing. In early 1992, he submitted his resignation. The letter was short, typed on department stationery. "For personal and family reasons, I am unable to continue my duties at this time. Respectfully, Deputy Larry D. Gibson." The sheriff accepted it without comment. When Larry left the office for the last time, a few colleagues stood by the door. No one knew whether to shake his hand. He nodded once, said, "Take care," and walked out. After Larry Gibson resigned, the family left Oregon quietly. No announcements, no farewells. One spring morning, their furniture was loaded into a rented truck. By the following week, the house on the gravel road stood empty. They moved 900 miles northeast, to a small town near Helena, Montana, a place where no one knew their faces. Larry told neighbors he'd left law enforcement to focus on family. He took a job selling insurance, shaved his mustache, traded his uniform for pressed shirts and ties. At first, the new town welcomed them. The local Mormon congregation helped them find a rental house on a quiet street. Larry joined the men's group on weekends. Judith brought the girls to church activities. People said she seemed tired but kind, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. For a few months they passed as ordinary, but under the surface, the silence grew thicker. Larry didn't talk about Oregon. When neighbors asked why they'd moved, he said only that it was a hard time. At home, he avoided the subject altogether. He kept to a routine: work, church, dinner, television. He spoke little to Judith, less to Karen. When the subject of Tommy surfaced, he would leave the room. Judith tried to be patient, but she felt the distance hardening. The weight of that unspoken absence lingered in every corner of the house. Tommy's name was never banned, yet never said aloud. When Judith prayed at night, she sometimes whispered his name under her breath, afraid Larry might hear. Karen, now 5, didn't understand the rules of silence. She still remembered her brother's face, the toy truck, the sound of his laughter in the yard. Sometimes she asked where he was. Other times she woke up crying, insisting she'd seen him in her dreams. "Daddy hurt Tommy," she mumbled once, half asleep, twisting in her blankets. Judith froze. It was the kind of sentence that hung in the air long after it was spoken. Fragile, but impossible to ignore. She asked Karen what she meant, but the child said nothing more. In the morning, she didn't seem to remember. At church, the Gibson story traveled in whispers. People knew something had happened back in Oregon, a missing child, a family tragedy, a man leaving the force. But the details were cloudy. The community offered sympathy at first, casseroles, visits. invitations to dinner. Then came distance. Conversation slowed when Larry entered a room. The warmth turned polite, then cool. Judith felt the isolation more deeply than he did. She missed her friends in Oregon, missed the few people who still asked about Tommy. In Montana, no one did. She tried to make new connections, mothers at church, neighbors, other young families. But the conversations always stayed on the surface. It was hard to build friendships around a story you couldn't tell. As months passed, the marriage began to fray. Larry withdrew further into routine, often spending evenings at the office or driving without explaining where. Judith grew suspicious, but said nothing. Their arguments, when they came, were quiet and cutting. "You don't talk to me," she said once at the dinner table. "I talk when there's something to say," he replied. After that, she stopped asking. Karen's nightmares became more frequent that winter. She would wake up screaming, saying she saw Tommy crying by the porch or lying on the ground. Judith sat with her until she fell asleep again, brushing her hair and whispering that everything was fine. But when Karen was asleep, Judith stayed awake, staring at the dark. She began to wonder if the child was remembering something, not dreaming it. One afternoon, while cleaning Karen's room, Judith found a crayon drawing tucked under the pillow. It showed 4 stick figures, a man, a woman, a small girl, and another figure drawn in faint gray, lying near the corner of the page. Above them was a yellow sun, smiling the way children's suns do. Judith folded the drawing and put it in her dresser. She never mentioned it to Larry. By early 1993, the distance between them had become impossible to ignore. Larry had started sleeping on the couch, claiming the baby's crying kept him awake. Judith didn't argue. She began making plans quietly, saving money from groceries, writing letters to her mother in Oregon. When she told Larry she wanted to go back home for a while, he didn't protest. "Do what you need to do," he said. It was the closest he'd come to permission in months. In March, Judith packed the car with clothes, toys, and the baby's things. Karen sat in the back seat, clutching a stuffed animal. Larry stood in the driveway, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself," he said. Judith looked at him for a long moment, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. Then she started the car and drove away. 3 years after Thomas Gibson vanished, the silence finally cracked. Not through evidence, not through new witnesses, but through the small, uncertain voice of a 7-year-old girl. It began in February 1994. Inside a small rental house in Eugene, Oregon, Karen Gibson had grown quieter with age, a cautious child, watchful eyes. She spoke carefully and never raised her voice. But that winter, she began to wake again in the middle of the night, crying for her brother. The nightmares had returned, sharper now, more vivid. Judith would find her sitting up in bed, trembling, saying she'd seen Tommy outside, that she could hear Daddy yelling. At first, Judith tried to soothe her with the same reassurances she'd offered for years. "It was a dream, honey. Daddy didn't mean to scare you." But the sentences didn't calm her anymore. The next morning, Judith noticed Karen had drawn another picture. This one showed a man in a brown uniform standing over a smaller figure on the ground. Above them, a car with flashing lights. She tucked the drawing away, but couldn't shake the unease. A week later, during a counseling session arranged through her elementary school, Karen began to talk. The counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Ellen Wright, asked gentle questions about home, about family, about what Karen remembered of Oregon before Montana. The child hesitated, then whispered something that made Ellen stop writing. That afternoon, Ellen called Judith to the office. Karen sat beside her mother, clutching a stuffed animal. Her words came out haltingly, pieced together from memory fragments. "Tommy followed Daddy outside," she said. "Daddy was mad. He told Tommy to stop." She made a quick motion with her hand, an imitation of a strike, then quieter. "He put him in the car, the one with the lights." Judith stared at her daughter, unsure what she was hearing. "Are you sure?" she asked. Karen nodded. "He told me not to tell. He said he'd put me in the hole, too." The room went still. Ellen Wright documented the statement. Following mandatory reporting laws, she contacted the Eugene Police Department. Within 24 hours, the file was transferred to Douglas County. The case of Thomas Gibson, missing since March 18, 1991, was reopened. Detectives arrived at Judith's home 2 days later. They listened carefully as she recounted the timeline: her relocation to Montana, the deterioration of the marriage, her decision to return to Oregon. They asked about Larry's behavior, about his temper, about anything unusual she might have noticed. Judith hesitated, then admitted what she had long ignored. There had been moments, small, isolated at first, where Larry's control had slipped. Once he'd thrown a chair when Karen spilled juice. Another time he'd shouted so loudly the baby started screaming. She had told herself it was stress, grief, exhaustion. Now she wasn't sure. The detectives recorded everything, thanking her for her honesty. When they left, one of them said quietly, "We'll need to talk to him." Back in Montana, Larry Gibson was still living in the same modest house. To his neighbors, he was polite, but detached. The man who waved, but rarely lingered. On April 14, 1994, 2 plainclothes officers from Oregon knocked on his door. They had a warrant for second-degree murder. Larry didn't resist. He opened the door, stepped aside, let them in. "I figured this would come," he said evenly. Inside the house, everything was tidy, curtains drawn, sink clean. A framed photograph of Tommy sat on a shelf, the boy smiling beneath a paper birthday hat. The officers read Larry his rights, cuffed him gently, led him to the car. As they passed the neighbor's lawn, a woman watering her garden paused to stare. Larry met her eyes briefly, nodded. He was extradited to Oregon within the week. When news of his arrest reached Eugene, Judith felt both vindicated and terrified. The past she had tried to outrun was now at her doorstep again. She agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing every document and letter she still had from their marriage. She also reached out to Larry's half-sister Debbie Kallick, who lived in Iowa. Debbie had stayed close to Judith after the separation, though contact with Larry had ended years earlier. On the phone, when Judith told her about the new investigation, Debbie went silent for several seconds. Then she said quietly, "I think I need to tell you something." A few days later, she gave her statement to police. She described a late-night phone call she'd received from Larry in the spring of 1991, weeks after Tommy's disappearance. His voice, she said, was frantic, uneven. He said, "I think I killed him." Those were his words. I asked what he meant, but he wouldn't explain. He just said it was an accident, that it all happened too fast. Then he hung up. Debbie had never gone to the police. At the time, she said, she thought Larry was having a breakdown. She regretted it now. Her testimony, combined with Karen's recollection, gave investigators what they needed: probable cause. The reopening of the case made headlines across Oregon. The story of the missing toddler had long been buried in small-town memory, but now the name Deputy Larry Gibson was back in print. The press described him as a former lawman accused of turning suspect. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Detectives re-examined every piece of evidence. They returned to the Gibson property in Azalea, now occupied by another family. They searched the creek again, the old woodpile, the fields beyond the fence. They dug through archived reports and found the notes from 1991. The inconsistencies, his jogging time, the odometer readings, the ballistics on the dead cat, the patterns that had once seemed like coincidences now looked like clues. Meanwhile, Larry sat in a county holding cell, calm as ever. Reporters waiting outside the courthouse shouted questions, but he never spoke. Through his attorney, he issued only one statement: "I am innocent of these accusations. I have no idea what happened to my son." The district attorney held a press conference confirming the arrest and the charge of second-degree murder. He spoke of new witness statements and significant corroboration of prior inconsistencies. He didn't mention the child by name, but everyone knew. The trial of Larry Dean Gibson opened on a cold January morning in 1995, nearly 4 years after his son had disappeared. Snow still lined the curbs outside the Douglas County Courthouse. The air inside the old building smelled of paper and dust. The courtroom filled early, reporters from Portland, a few national outlets, neighbors from Azalea who had driven north to watch, law enforcement officers who once worked beside the man now seated at the defense table. Larry sat quietly, shoulders squared, hands folded before him. His face was drawn, older than his 40 years, but calm. The badge he once wore had long been turned in. His suit hung too loose at the collar. Judith Gibson was there too, sitting near the back beside her sister. She held a tissue in her hands but didn't use it. Karen was not in the room yet, though her name was on everyone's lips. The prosecution called the case State of Oregon versus Larry Dean Gibson. The charge, second-degree murder in the death of Thomas Dean Gibson, age 2. From the outset, the prosecution built its story carefully. District Attorney Michael Warner spoke slowly, methodically, laying out the narrative piece by piece. "This is a case about a moment of anger," he began, "a moment that ended a life, and 3 years of silence that followed it." According to the state's theory, the morning of March 18, 1991, had begun normally. Larry went for a jog, took his gun with him, shot a stray cat near the edge of the property. Tommy, curious and unsteady on his feet, followed the sound. When the child approached the cat's body, Larry lost his temper, angry at the interruption, at the mess, at himself, and struck the boy. The blow was too hard. Tommy fell, hit his head, went still. What happened next, Warner said, was the act that turned a tragedy into a crime. Instead of calling for help, he told the jury Larry Gibson, a deputy sheriff, used his training not to save a life, but to hide what he had done. The prosecution argued that Larry carried the child's body to his patrol car, placed him in a plastic bag, and drove to a remote spot during the chaos of the search. There he disposed of the remains before returning to the scene, showered, shaved, dressed in uniform, ready to join the search for the child he knew could not be found. It was a story built from fragments, testimony, timelines, memories pulled from a frightened child's mind, but it was enough for a trial. Karen Gibson was called to the stand on the third day. At 7 years old, she looked impossibly small in the witness chair, legs swinging above the floor, voice barely rising above a whisper. The courtroom went still as she adjusted the microphone. The judge leaned forward, gentle, reminding her to take her time. She told the story carefully, as though each word might break. She said that she remembered that day, the sun, the yard, the cat near the road. She remembered Tommy following their father, and how Daddy had yelled at him. "He got mad," she said. "He hit Tommy and carried him to the car. Then he drove away." "Did your father say anything to you after that?" the prosecutor asked. Karen hesitated, then nodded. "He told me not to tell," she said. "He said he'd put me in the hole, too." There was a murmur in the courtroom. The judge called for silence. Karen's voice never rose, never cracked. She spoke the way children do when they've learned that quiet is safer than noise. When she stepped down, she glanced once toward her mother. Judith gave her a small, trembling nod. The defense began its work immediately after. Attorney John Callahan, appointed to represent Larry, stood and thanked the girl for her honesty before turning to the jury. "Memory," he said, "is not a perfect instrument, especially not when it belongs to a child who has lived through fear, separation, and suggestion." Callahan's strategy was built on skepticism. He argued that Karen's recollection had been shaped over years of exposure to questions, therapy, her mother's grief. "She believes she remembers," he said, "but belief is not the same as truth." He called expert witnesses in childhood memory, psychologists who explained how suggestion could implant images that felt real. One expert compared it to a photograph developed in the wrong chemicals, recognizable but distorted. He also pointed to the absence of physical evidence. No body, no blood, no weapon tied to a crime. "We have a story," Callahan said, "but not a single piece of tangible proof that Thomas Gibson was killed at all." He gestured toward Larry. "This man has been accused of the most terrible act imaginable, but ask yourselves, where is the evidence that it happened?" Larry himself did not testify. His attorney advised against it, saying his demeanor could be misread. The jurors never heard his voice except in recordings from his police interviews. In them, he sounded calm, almost detached. "I don't know what happened," he said repeatedly. "I came back and he was gone." Midway through the trial, the prosecution called Debbie Callick, Larry's half-sister, to the stand. She wore a gray suit and looked directly at her brother as she testified. She recounted the late-night phone call she had received in 1991. "He sounded scared," she said. "He said, 'I think I killed him.'" Her voice trembled slightly but didn't waver. "I asked who. He said, 'Tommy.' He told me it was an accident, that he didn't mean to. Then he hung up." When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, she lowered her eyes. "Because I didn't want to believe it," she said. "You tell yourself it was a dream, that you misunderstood. You don't want it to be true." The defense attacked her memory too, pointing out that no phone record survived from that year. That stress can change how people recall words. But her testimony lingered. Next came Judith. She entered the courtroom quietly, her expression composed. On the stand, she described their life together, how Larry had been respected, disciplined, devout. But she also spoke of the darker moments, his temper, his silences, the way he could turn cold in an instant. "He wasn't always violent," she said, "but when he was angry, it was like he wasn't there anymore." She described one night in Montana when he struck the wall beside her head. "He told me once," she said softly, "people think I'm the law, but they don't know me at home." The courtroom held its breath. As the trial entered its fifth week, the lines between memory and fact blurred. The jury listened to experts debate psychology, detectives retrace timelines, lawyers argue the definition of intent. There were moments when the case seemed to collapse under its own contradictions. Then, in closing arguments, the prosecution returned to simplicity. "You've heard the stories," Warner told the jury, "the theories, the doubt. But look at what doesn't change. A healthy child vanished. His father's story never fit. His daughter remembered what she saw. His sister remembered what he confessed. You don't need to find the body to recognize the truth." The defense countered with precision. "We don't convict on feelings," Callahan said. "We convict on facts, and there are none here. If Thomas Gibson is gone, we don't know how or why or by whose hand. To punish a man on uncertainty is to abandon the very justice he once swore to uphold." The courtroom stayed silent as the jury filed out to deliberate. They were gone for 2 days. Judith didn't attend court during that time. She stayed home, waiting for the phone to ring. Larry remained still, staring at the wall, lips pressed into a thin line. On the third day, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone rose as the jurors filed in. The foreman held a folded piece of paper. The clerk took it and read aloud. "On the charge of murder in the second degree, we find the defendant not guilty." A pause. "On the lesser charge of manslaughter in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." The air shifted in the room. Larry exhaled once, eyes fixed forward. Judith closed her eyes, her face unreadable. The judge thanked the jury for their service and turned to sentencing. Under Oregon law, the range for first-degree manslaughter was 15 to 18 months. Because Larry had already served most of that time in custody during trial, the sentence amounted to little more than a formality. When the gavel came down, it sounded less like justice and more like an ending forced into words. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Deputy convicted in son's death. Manslaughter, not murder. Neighbors offered quiet opinions. Some called it mercy, others failure. Outside the courthouse, Judith walked quickly to her car, head down. A reporter called after her. "Do you think justice was done?" She didn't answer. Larry was led away without handcuffs. His attorney whispered something in his ear. He nodded once. That evening, the courthouse steps emptied. The cameras packed up, and the story that had begun in a small Oregon yard returned to the quiet it had always carried. Larry Gibson was released from the Oregon State Penitentiary in September 1996, a year and a half after the verdict. Technically, he had already served most of his sentence during the long months leading up to trial. When the prison gate opened that morning, there were no cameras waiting, no family reunion, no crowd to meet him, only a single parole officer standing beside a government sedan. The officer handed him a folder containing his release papers, conditions of supervision, an envelope with $47 in cash. Larry signed the last form, thanked the man, and walked out into the pale Oregon light. He was 43 years old and already looked older. His hair had thinned at the temples. The rigid posture of a deputy had been replaced by something slower, more deliberate. When he stepped outside, he didn't turn back. He moved quietly at first, taking a small apartment in Montana under a shortened name, L.D. Gibson, found work again as an insurance adjuster. His employer, a local firm, didn't ask many questions. He didn't volunteer any answers. In the paperwork, the blank space for children remained unfilled. The parole reports from that period were uneventful. He checked in monthly, completed community service, kept his head down, polite, cooperative, emotionally flat, one officer wrote. But outside the forms, the world hadn't forgotten. The public was divided sharply, irreparably. For some, the conviction had been a compromise they could live with. It was an accident, one neighbor told a local newspaper. A good man lost his temper and panicked. That doesn't make him evil. Others called it a miscarriage of justice. A father, a trained officer, killed his child and walked free within a year. If his name wasn't Gibson, he'd still be in a cell. Editorials debated it for months after his release. One headline read, "Deputy or Criminal, Oregon still split on the Gibson case." Another framed it more bluntly, "When a badge becomes a shield." In Azalea, the house where it all began still stood at the end of the same gravel road. A new family lived there, a young couple with 2 kids who played in the same front yard. They told reporters they never felt haunted by the place. "We just don't talk about it," the husband said. "It's easier that way." Judith refused every interview request. She and the girls had long since moved to a small town outside Eugene, living under her maiden name. The local school listed Karen and Lisa under their stepfather's surname after Judith remarried briefly in 1998. When a reporter from Portland knocked on her door, she closed it softly and said, "That part of our lives is over." Her silence was absolute, but not empty. Larry, on the other hand, refused to disappear completely. In early 2001, using an outdated dial-up modem and a borrowed desktop computer, he created a simple website on a free hosting service. The title page read, "Searching for the Truth About Tommy." The site was primitive, white background, black text, no images. At the top was a statement, "My name is Larry Gibson. I am a father. My son disappeared in 1991 from our home in Azalea, Oregon. I was wrongfully accused and convicted of his death. I served my time, but I will not rest until the truth is found." He updated it irregularly, posting scanned copies of old documents, fragments of news articles, his own commentary written in a detached, almost bureaucratic tone. "The evidence was circumstantial," one entry read. "There was no body, No cause of death, no motive. My daughter's memory was manipulated through therapy and suggestion. In another post, he wrote, "If Tommy is still alive, I pray that one day he will read this." Few people found the page, but those who did left polarized comments. Some offered sympathy, others rage. "You're a liar," one message said simply. "You don't get to call it truth." Larry never replied. By 2003, the domain expired. The site vanished from the internet. But the Gibson case refused to vanish with it. In the mid-1990s, the television series Unsolved Mysteries featured the story twice, framing it as one of the most perplexing missing child cases in Oregon history. The first episode aired in 1994, before the arrest, portraying Larry as a grieving father desperate for answers. The second aired in 1996, after his conviction, revisiting the same footage but with an entirely different tone, now as a cautionary tale about deception and trust. Robert Stack's narration, calm and grave, said, "How could a trained officer of the law lose his son within sight of his own front porch? And what really happened on that quiet morning in March 1991? Both broadcasts reignited public debate. Letters poured into the Douglas County Sheriff's Office and the Oregon State Police tip line. Some claimed to have seen a child matching Tommy's description years later. Others accused the department of covering up one of their own. None of the tips led anywhere. In 1993, before the trial, Tommy's face had also appeared in the now famous Runaway Train music video by Soul Asylum, a project that displayed missing children's photos on screen. He was the youngest child featured, his baby blue eyes blinking across MTV screens around the world. The line that accompanied his image read, "If you've seen this child, please call." By the time the video aired again in 1996, he was officially listed as deceased in court documents. Though no remains had ever been found, the contradiction went unaddressed. Still, for a few seconds, his face lived again, frozen between lyrics about loss and escape, broadcast to millions. It was as close to immortality as a missing child could get. In Douglas County, the sheriff's office archived the case file that same year. The binders, marked Gibson, T.D. Missing Person, Open Unresolved, were boxed and stored in the evidence annex. Inside were maps of search grids, photographs of the yard, transcripts of interviews, and one final page stamped in red, Case Status, Closed, Exceptional Clearance. The file still referred to the incident as a disappearance. Nowhere in the paperwork was the word murder written. A young detective who joined the department in 1999 found the box years later and leafed through the pages. "It felt incomplete," he said later, "like looking at something that wanted to keep its secrets." He closed the lid and put it back. As for the family, they lived in the long shadow of what couldn't be proven. Judith kept no photographs of Larry in the house. Karen, entering her teens, learned not to talk about her father when people asked. When classmates discovered the old news stories online, she claimed they were about someone else. Lisa, the youngest, knew her father only through a few newspaper clippings and her mother's silence. Once, in a rare interview decades later, Judith's sister said, "She forgave him in a way, but not like people think, not forgiveness that frees you, just the kind that lets you sleep." In Montana, Larry aged quietly. He bought a small trailer outside of town, planted tomatoes, kept to himself. He told people he was divorced, that his son had died young. He never mentioned the trial. Once a year, on March the 18th, he left flowers near the edge of a creek outside town. When asked about it by a neighbor, he said, "For my boy. He's still out there somewhere." There were no cameras this time, no statements, no searches. Only a man and his reflection in the water. 34 years have passed since Thomas Dean Gibson disappeared. He would be 36 years old now. Somewhere in the forests of southern Oregon, his remains may still rest, hidden in a place only one person knows. His face is frozen in time, a 2-year-old boy with brown eyes, a gap-toothed smile, a small scar above his eyebrow, a boy who loved his father, who called out, "Bye-bye, Daddy," on the last morning of his life. The case is still open. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office keeps the file in storage, dust settling on its edges. Every few years, a new detective pulls it out, reads through the old reports, looks at the maps, the timelines, the photographs, and closes it again, because without a body, there's nowhere left to search. Judith lives quietly now, in a small house with a garden. She doesn't talk about the past, doesn't give interviews. She's learned that some stories don't have endings, only stopping points. Karen is in her 30s now, married, a mother herself. She's never spoken publicly about what she testified to in 1995. When her own children ask about their grandfather, she tells them he's gone and changes the subject. Lisa, who never knew Tommy, carries the absence differently. She's the only one who sometimes asks questions, who wants to know more. But the answers she gets are always the same. It was a long time ago. We don't talk about it anymore. Larry Gibson still lives in Montana. He's in his 70s now, retired, widowed after a second marriage that ended quietly. He plays guitar at a local church, sings country songs at open mic nights, smiles politely when people compliment his voice. No one there knows his story, and he's learned not to tell it. On March 18th every year, the sun rises over Azalea, Oregon, the same way it did in 1991. The roads are still gravel, the woods are still dense. The houses still sit at the ends of long driveways. The mobile home where the Gibsons lived has been repainted. The fence has been replaced. The yard has been mowed 1,000 times. But the memory lingers. This case asks a question that will never be answered. Not in a courtroom, not in a confession, not in the ground. What happened to Thomas Dean Gibson? Did his father lose his temper in a moment of rage and spend the rest of his life hiding what he'd done? Or is there some other explanation? Some detail we still don't know? Some truth that died with the silence? The jury decided Larry was responsible, but they couldn't say how, or why, or where, and without those answers, the story remains unfinished. A child vanished, a father was convicted, a sister spoke the truth. But the boy was never found. And that absence, 34 years long, echoes louder than any verdict ever could. If you have any information about the location of Thomas Dean Gibson's remains, please contact the Douglas County Sheriff's Office at 541-440-4470. His family deserves to bring him home. Karen deserves to finally close the chapter she opened when she was 7 years old. Judith deserves to bury her son, and Tommy, wherever he is, deserves to be found. In 1991, a 2-year-old boy vanished from his front yard in rural Oregon. For 3 years, his family searched for answers. When the truth finally came, it was incomplete. A conviction without a body, a story without an ending. This is what remains: a name, a face, a memory, and a question that will never stop being asked. Where is Tommy Gibson? Thanks for watching. If this story got to you, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery. See you soon.